Greetings from Brussels as we rush towards the end of what's been another surreal and exhausting year and towards a much needed holiday for most of us. A warm welcome to you all on behalf of Science Business, Europe's leading media company focused on research and innovation policy, and also on behalf of our network of 70 plus leading R&D organizations in Europe and beyond, of which I have the pleasure of coordinating in my day job. So, as many of you will be aware, Science Business has been closely following COP and climate tech developments for months now. I think many of you will have seen our dedicated news section on the website. But today's event is very much our latest contribution to the ongoing debate about turning COP commitments into action, and specifically what the COP outcomes mean for research and innovation. So this afternoon's agenda is pretty straightforward. It's broken down into two parts. First, we're going to be hearing perspectives from the UK presidency of COP26 and the UK's government's science, tech and innovation approach in climate strategy. And second, we're going to have a wider debate about the implications of the Glasgow outcomes for European R&D in terms of policy, investment, industry and its scientific communities. So, to get us started, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, the Right Honourable George Freeman, who's the Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation for the UK government. So, Minister Freeman, thank you very much for joining us today. How are things in London?
Pleasure, Simon. Great to be with you. This is a key conversation, and I'm delighted to report that London is sunny and blue skies, and it's a beautiful November day.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let's start with Glasgow, because it must have been an utterly exhausting process for you and many of your colleagues. But now that the dust is settled, there's obviously been some time for reflection on what Glasgow achieved or perhaps didn't achieve. So I just wonder if we can start with your main takeaways. What do you think were the headline outcomes from the COP26 conference, and perhaps some of the regrets about things that you desperately wanted to achieve but couldn't quite get into place?
Yeah, thanks. Just by way of background for any of your new minister, newly appointed 6 weeks in, Minister for Science, Research and Innovation, elected in 2010 with Prime Minister Cameron. Before that, a 15-year career in science and technology, venture capital and financing, including clean tech, agri-tech and biotech. So that's my background. And the role that I have here is to deliver Prime Minister Johnson's science superpower and innovation nation vision. It's a major commitment, actually. The UK is embarking on a new economic model, nothing smaller than that. We're moving really from a sort of if you characterize our economic model from 1945 to 79, post-war reconstruction, house building and road building and Harold Macmillan, you've never had it so good. 79 to 2009, a pretty service economy, post-industrial, City of London-led, consumer booms in housing and retail. And we decided to take the global financial crisis, the Brexit vote and the pandemic as an opportunity to reboot our economic model and to focus much more heavily as a nation on science and innovation. And I've been a leading advocate of that in the UK, and it's for that reason that I've been put into this job. And at the heart of that is a commitment to implement net zero and to take net zero from being a sort of important global aspiration to something that we mainstream in the UK economy. We invest in the science and technology for sustainable growth, for clean energy, for moving away from hydrocarbons, and the science and technology for long-term sustainable renewables. And that is a big commitment, both for the UK economy, but also to help the world to go through the agricultural industrial revolutions that we need global emerging developing economies to go through in the next 30 years with zero carbon, models that we led in this country on a very high carbon model over 300 years. And there's a moral element to this. We think we have a duty to help the rest of the world avoid the crisis of climate emergency and go through a growth cycle where green technologies support growth. So that's the big picture. And look, headlines on COP. I think the headline is this. The world has really woken up to this emergency. I mean, I think all of us would say probably 20 years later than we really should have done. I think in the last 10 years, you've seen extraordinary progress. The UK has now completely moved away from coal. We had our first coal-free day on the grid 18 months, 2 years ago, and no economy has moved faster away from hydrocarbons. But I think the significance of this COP was we had the Paris Agreement hanging in the air, big commitment to a target. What we needed to do was turn the target into action, into specific, tangible actions across the board. And I think, you know, the headline, 90% of the economy, global economy, is now covered by net zero commitments. That's up from 30%, a big increase over the course of the UK's presidency. We've got almost 200 countries now signed up to the Glasgow Climate Pact to keep the goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And that pact saw countries grounding commitments to climate science, agreeing to return to in 2022 with increased commitments to accelerate tangible action, strengthening international cooperation, and endorsing that very important final call to wind down coal and move away from coal as a power source, and concluding the Paris rulebook, and a whole lot of very important details on transparency, the Article 6 on carbon markets, common timeframes, and really significant practical measures on coal, cars, cash, and trees. Over 140 leaders, that's 90% of the world's forests, pledged to halt and reverse forest loss. 65 countries committed to phasing out coal. You know, these are very big, substantial measures, 100 billion finance to be met for developed countries. So no summit is perfect, but I think history will judge that Glasgow took the urgency warning from Paris and turned it into practical, tangible commitments to actually accelerate us towards a net zero global economy. And that's a big step forward.
That's absolutely true. Thank you for those opening remarks, Minister. I think, you know, obviously the Glasgow breakthroughs were one of the main outcomes, right? And so when you talk about transitioning from, you know, commitments to action, then I guess the process that the UK presidency has started also with the global checkpoint process is going to be an important part of this, of sort of holding those commitments to account, or the countries making those commitments to account. So how do you see this process developing going forward? What are your main goals for the first few months of next year before we build up to the next COP?
I think you're right, Simon, and I just pay tribute to Alok Sharma. You know, I think he's brought to this process a very, some might say managerial, but a very trusted, competent, quiet, implementation focused approach to move from very grandiose statements that the public then don't believe are actually being implemented to real tangible actions that will be monitored. And so that global checkpoint process is fundamental to that. What it comprises really is, firstly, the kind of state of the nation, the state of the globe report on the scale and progress on transition, working in collaboration with IRENA, the United Nations High-Level Climate Action Champions, and other institutions. So annual reporting on progress. Secondly, convening leaders in each sector to bring together the government, non-state and international organizations to actually drive through the deliverables and tackle obstacles. So practical work streams. Thirdly, the interministerial working groups on the state of the transition. So developing that breakthrough agenda and working with, alongside the Mission Innovation and Clean Energy ministerial meetings hosted by the US next year to drive that forward. And fourthly, encouraging new leader level commitments. So I think that's important that, you know, in the past, I think summits have sort of made big declarations and then the energy level has dropped off. And we've locked into this process a very strong commitment to keep the pressure up every year. So I think it's important actually. And I think in time, this will come to be seen as the kind of the big development of Glasgow, moved from big promises to actionable, trackable, manageable implementation.
Good, thank you. So, I mean, listen, as the person who's now in charge of science, technology and innovation policy for the UK, I mean, I'm sure you're in regular dialogues with your peers in other advanced R&D nations and others that are striving to catch up. So are there aspects of what's come out of Glasgow that are encouraging a rethink of current policy, or new areas where you think there's new investment and focus that needs to be channeled, or is it a case of doing more of the same, only better and faster?
No, COP has accelerated our thinking and shifted our policy. I would say it's kind of 80-20. I mean, we'd already made very substantial commitments on innovation in net zero. We've recently set out a net zero R&D strategy across government, which is a very comprehensive plan for the next 10 years of how we support those technologies. I mean, I want to emphasize that we're not in the game of sort of magic bullets. We don't think there's some perfect magic bullet technical solution that can allow everyone to fly around in planes and some piece of science will save us. We're equally committed to the daily change of commuting patterns, travel to work patterns, and building net zero in at ground zero in the daily economies. But let me just highlight some of those science and technology pieces. I mean, the first thing to say, we've made a very major commitment in the budget this year for the next 3 years, where it's a 30% increase in UK public R&D. So we're going to be going to 20 billion a year spend, and then on to 24 billion. And crucially, we're going to be matching and exceeding that rise with private sector investment. So we're going to be pulling in about 70 billion of investment into the UK economy over the next 5 years. And at the heart of that, net zero is the biggest element of that science and technology push. And that's everything from near market deploying hydrogen, near market EVs, near market gigafactories, near market grid, smart metering, the interconnector infrastructure in the southern North Sea, but also downstream, some very exciting things. I'm this morning just chaired our UK fusion energy program. We're making huge investments in being the first nation to deploy fusion energy, which I think is an incredibly exciting technology that allow us to generate small nuclear, incredible levels of power to supplement our broader renewables program. Secondly, I'd highlight the very big investments we're making in agri-tech. You know, that we've cleaned up our energy system, but the two next big areas are agriculture and transport. And as former Minister for Agri-Tech, we're investing heavily in the drought-resistant crops, the disease-resistant crops. For example, the blight-resistant potato. Each potato crop at the moment has to be sprayed with about 14 applications of fungicide. That is incredibly high carbon footprint activity. The pesticides themselves are high carbon to make, and the application is high carbon. Well, we've developed a blight-resistant potato. I'm sorry to say it was banned by the European Union, and post-Brexit, we're now going to be moving on it, and we're investing heavily in agri-genetics so we can do more of reducing the carbon footprint, but also using space and satellite technologies, precision agriculture, minimum tilth. So huge reduction in carbon in agriculture. And in transport, we're deploying hydrogen at scale, not just making hydrogen, green hydrogen on the coast, but we're going to switch our agriculture, haulage, and rail industry, and shipping into hydrogen. So these are big commitments. They need to be, because if we're going to get to net zero and we're going to lead the way for the world, we can't just talk. We've got to do it. We've got to walk the walk. We've got to invest and be bold enough to lead the way.
On three really important things here: money, new technologies, and the world. And I think obviously one of the signal outcomes from Glasgow was the at least getting very close to, if not fully at, the 100 billion commitment in terms of financing for at-risk nations elsewhere in the world. But what can we do, or what can governments such as the UK do to ensure that the new technologies actually reach developing and at-risk nations as well as the climate situation evolves in the years to come? Are there new models? Were there any dialogues in Glasgow about ways to do this better and more effectively, so it's not just elite technologies for the few, but really for the many?
Yeah, I think this is it's a brilliant question and a really important point. So, as you say, the financial commitment has been made. It's a big thing. The advanced economies understanding that we can't just do this for ourselves. We have got to support those vulnerable and lower income nations. But you're also right that we can't just be parachuting technology into island states that face climate emergencies. We've got to do tech transfer and also help develop the resilient economies on the ground in their part of the world. And there's a whole series of ways we're doing that, not just through our international aid commitments, but actually we've put in place, and I'm in the process of reviewing and deploying money and thinking about what we can do to better drive that technology transfer through our international science program and our post-Brexit global science and innovation models of engagement. I mean, personally, and this is a personal point of mine rather than a COP26 statement, I'm having had a career in technology transfer, I'm very struck that actually there's an opportunity, I think, for the UK to take some areas in the world where we've got very deep legacy, Commonwealth legacy. I mean, I know East Africa very well, but you could pick 6 or 7 areas around the world. I'd like us to be thinking about sort of deeper development partnership for those areas, where for them, by agreement, a 10-year development agreement, we think about sort of doubling the aid, doubling the security, and 10xing the trade, and helping them really accelerate into a modern economy. And it would be good for them, good for us, good for trade, good for investment, and dare I say it, good for tackling the global migration out of Africa, the pressure on Europe's borders, and it's a fairer model of growth. And we can do that globally, but I think each nation has got a role to play in helping to use its links where it's got them. And for example, in agriculture, the UK, as recently as 50, 60 years ago, we were the global leader in tropical agriculture. I visited a few years ago the Institute for Tropical Agriculture in Nairobi. Well, it's been shut now. It's got plants growing through the ceiling, but it was a UK largely Cambridge Centre for Excellence in Tropical Agriculture. I want us to be reinstigating those networks so that we can practically help with tech transfer.
Fascinating case study to watch going forward, I think, because obviously this is very high on the European Union's agenda as well. And a little later in this afternoon's event, we'll talk about some of the international cooperation aspects within the EU policy space. But just to remain at sort of the international level for a while, I think one of the most important developments in the last arguably year and a half, but in particular around Glasgow, was the return of the US to the climate and energy table in a significant way. Was that in some way a game changer in terms of the outcome of the conference of the parties? Does the US, at least under this administration and its renewed commitments, prompt a rethink? It opens a window of opportunity for leading countries to do more in terms of the climate and energy partnerships that we need to drive net zero.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it does, actually. When President Biden declared America's back, I think the experience in Afghanistan would suggest that America's back on the international stage, probably more strongly committed to net zero than to liberal interventions militarily. But, I think notwithstanding all the challenges, America has got huge legacy investment and stake in hydrocarbons. But I think John Kerry's work as COP ambassador shouldn't be underestimated. He was absolutely fundamental alongside Alok Sharma in brokering those very practical commitments on cash, coal, trees, and cars. And I think, whilst it's not perfect, I mean, I just ask people to imagine what the outcome might have been if President Trump had been president. I think it would have given license to a lot more countries around the world to say, well, if that's America's view, why should we be forced into action? And I think it may have heightened tensions with China and made the prospects of getting the agreements we have much lower. So, you know, I think America have made a big contribution. There's a lot more to do. They understand that, but I think John Kerry has been instrumental, and you know, I think they've played a big role in this actually, and it's important because unless the rest of the world can see that the advanced nations are taking big and quite difficult steps, then very difficult for them to follow.
Many listening today would agree, and we all have to hope that this will be a medium to long-term legacy and not just something that ends or is obstructed in the next couple of years. So Minister, perhaps one final question before you need to leave us, and that brings us back to the question of UK-EU cooperation. Now, it's not to delve into the political issues which have been complicating matters, but, you know, obviously around the Glasgow breakthroughs, for example, there are commitments from the UK, the European Union, and 40 plus other nations to work together very closely on the decarbonisation of the four sectors, on establishing a global hydrogen market, amongst other areas. So does this change anything in the dynamic of how you see the UK-EU cooperation in science and tech going forward? Does it strengthen the case for association to Horizon Europe, for example? Or are there other sort of takeaways from Glasgow that you think can really strengthen the relationship going forward?
Yeah, I think this is really important. I want to emphasize that although the UK has left the European Political Union and Monetary Union, the integration towards effectively one state, we have absolutely not left the European culture and collaborative network of European nations and values, commitment to liberal democracy and to the mutuality of the values that we share. And Boris Johnson as Prime Minister was consistently clear through the Brexit process that we would remain part of Horizon and Euratom and Copernicus. And that was a fundamental commitment for me. I mean, I was quite a noisy Remainer during the referendum in the UK. Now that debate is over and the public have voted and we've left the European Political Union. But I think it's important that people can see that Boris Johnson's government includes people from all sides of this. And he's put me in this role partly because of my commitment to work very strongly to build those science and innovation networks. And just to confirm for everyone, the UK very strongly is seeking association. We agreed that as part of our withdrawal agreement last December. That's nearly 12 months ago. We've been pushing this year for the association to be completed. We're hungry to associate to Horizon and hoping very much that that won't be blocked. But I have to be, you know, I have to be alert enough to the high politics that we don't need me to describe. It's obvious. We can see in the newspapers things that there's difficulties around Northern Ireland and the protocol and fishing, and there are elections in Europe, and you know everyone's under pressure. And I am now in the process of working with the research community here in the UK to prepare in case the European Union doesn't allow us to associate. And so we're working on an alternative program. But let me stress very clearly that is a backstop rather than an aim. The cabinet met 3 weeks ago. I was there, and we confirmed, the whole cabinet, that British policy is to associate to Horizon. But many of our researchers who are part of that Horizon program and value the fellowships and value the collaborations are worried about what might happen to their bids if we don't associate. So I'm working on a guarantee so that we will stand behind them. We ring-fence the money that we would be putting into Horizon, and if we're not allowed to associate, we'll spend it on science, and we'll put together a program with European, British, and international researchers and try and do something that complements Horizon. Let me be clear. You know, science doesn't happen in silos. It doesn't happen behind walls. It's not something that happens just within national boundaries. And one of the great values of European integration has been science collaboration. And I think coming out of COP, it's very clear that, you know, for global net zero, clusters around the world are going to have to grip it. And the European cluster of nations is, you know, 30 of us on one western end of the Asian continent. We share a lot in common, a lot of climate challenges, a lot of coterminous trade, and we need to work together to define what net zero means for us. It'll be different for Africa, for South America, for North America, for China and India, but it's vital that we work together on that. And I'm, really proud. The other day I was on the British Antarctic Survey research ship that she sailed for Antarctica. It's one of the world's great polar ice research platforms, and it's full of international scientists from all across Europe and all around the world. And we're absolutely committed to those collaborations. And I'm reaching out to nations on a bilateral basis, but also hoping that we can, through Horizon and Euratom and Copernicus, remain very, very linked into those programs.
A really positive message to end on, Minister. Thank you for putting it in such optimistic and committed terms. And I think it goes without saying there would be a huge sigh of relief breathed on both sides of the channel if we end up with a positive outcome and the UK association in the months to come. So, Minister Freeman, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We wish you great success in your ongoing endeavours, and we'll look forward to following the UK's progress in the months to come. So, time for us now to switch to the other side of the water and the European research and innovation context. And it pretty much goes without saying, Europe has been a front runner in many climate and environment related areas over the last few decades, but in particular doubling down in the last few years with the Green Deal, its 2050 climate neutrality goal, Fit for 55, 30 billion plus committed in Horizon Europe to climate and energy related topics. But of course, achieving these green policy goals is going to be heavily reliant on science and technology and innovation communities to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And of course, the other key success factor will be whether or not the policy leaders can bring industry, financial communities, and the scientific world along with them on this journey. So I'm delighted to now be joined by four very esteemed guests from the worlds of policy, industry, science, and investment to talk about what the post-COP landscape means for European research and innovation. So first and foremost, a welcome to Joanna Drake, the Deputy Director General for Implementation, Impact and Sustainable Investment at DG Research at the European Commission. Welcome to you, Joanna.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Luc Goossens, who's the Chief Technology Officer at NG Research. We have Gerard Govers, who's the Vice Rector for Science, Technology and Engineering at the Catholic University of Leuven. And last but by no means least, Gunnar Munt, who's the Director General for Corporate Services at the European Investment Bank, or Europe's Climate Bank, as we like to call you these days. So a very warm welcome to you all. Let's start with kind of an icebreaker, similar to Minister Freeman. I'd like you just to take sort of a minute and a half, and just basically let me know, what was your most significant takeaway or outcomes from Glasgow, either for your organisation or for European research and innovation at large? And let's start with Joanna, if we may.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good afternoon to everybody. Let me put it this way. I would say it is definitely the good direction of travel, what has managed to be achieved in Glasgow. But certainly, there's a lot of work still to be done, and we need to aim higher. Now, if I just assess or measure according to what ex ante we have set as objectives as European Union, we said, okay, we need to keep up the pressure on the parties to step up their commitments to cut the emissions within this decade. Secondly, we need to reassure developing countries that the donors will actually keep on being committed to the target of $100 billion per year through 2025. Thirdly, the rule book, we need to complete that. In other words, we need to make the implementation, the monitoring transparent and realistic and serious. And I think progress has been made across the board. First of all, I think we need, however, more ambition. And why do I say that? Because we need to go faster and we need to go better. I mean, if we look, for instance, on the commitments that have been made on coal and fossil fuels, we have seen in the mainstream media, the phasing down as opposed to the phasing out. I mean, there has been progress despite the pushback from China and India. But at the same time, the IMF tells us that the government still spend $11 million a minute on fossil fuel subsidies. So, of course, we need to do much more in order to reach our targets by 2030 and then 2050. I mean, in the order of 45% of the current emissions. So obviously, we can't keep on, playing around with the phasing ins and phasing out. We need to go much higher than that. Finally, we have the rule book, which means that all parties have agreed on how to report on the progress against their emission reduction targets and also finalize the rules for operation. But again, we need to keep very much a critical eye on the close eye that this will actually happen and that we've got the tools to make it happen. Obviously, we have agreed as well to double the collective donors' contribution to adaptation finance from 2019 levels to 2025. Again, very good. But these are, I would say, in total, I would say a good next step. It's a good start to climate diplomacy, but of course, there's still much more if we really want to keep the 1.5 degree less, or rather as maximum, as a live desire.
Thank you, Joanna. So urgency and acceleration in equal measure. Okay, let's stick to our alphabetical order to begin with. And Luke Goossens from ENGIE, thank you for being with us. One of the leading companies in terms of renewable energy and positioning worldwide. What was your takeaway from Glasgow? What do you think it means for you and potentially your sector?
Good afternoon, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, well, for ENGIE, this was a clear confirmation of a road we had already taken a few years back. And I think what former Secretary Kerry said during one of the interviews is that industry is now going ahead of a lot of the governments and the organizations around it. I think that's true, and I see it in my company. We were one of the companies who already started changing our strategy towards that net carbon strategy a few years back. We are very happy to see that things like coal phasing out has now been confirmed. We've been doing this over the last 5 years. We cut down by 70% our coal assets, so that's a significant one, and we'll be doing that in the coming 5 years. Zero will be out of coal in 2027. We were also happy to see that there was a quite reasonable approach on the phasing out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. That's super important, but it also shows that within the transition, you will need some kind of support or to cover that first period. So we're happy about that. Now, we have engaged with our company on a net zero trajectory for 2045. And we'll be doing that on all three scopes. That's important. And I think that's also quite exemplary within the competitive field we are playing, because this means that adding that third scope, that we will have to reduce by even 70% more our carbon emissions on that side. And we are engaged to get there. We have our trajectory played out, and that will include, and this was something else which was shown in COP26, it's not only about power, it's not only about electricity, it's also about industry, which will be one of the big challenges. And if we look to industry, there will be a lot which will be playing around green gases, green molecules. I think we are quite convinced that green molecules will be the key in the coming 10 to 15 years in research and development to get to that carbon neutrality and to that 1.5 degree scenario. And there's still a long way to go. There's a lot to be done on shipping, on aviation, on industry, but the green molecules can be made. All the ingredients are there with carbon captures, with green hydrogen, and it will not be only about green hydrogen. It will be a start, but there will be much more than that. So we're quite aligned on that. We were happy to see these things popping out of the COP27 in the end.
Thank you. Now, let's turn to Gerard Govers in Leuven. And Gerard, you're the Vice Rector at one of Europe's leading technology universities, and pretty involved in the broader sort of planetary systems, plant sciences, earth sciences field. So, on one level, I think Glasgow did a wonderful job of validating the importance of scientific evidence for these kinds of intergovernmental processes and for policymaking. But as a scientist, And what do you and your colleagues take away from the meeting? What have the conversations been like in Leuven since Glasgow ended?
Well, good afternoon, Simon. So, well, the first thing is, of course, that indeed we are scientists and we are worried about the planet, and we have voiced that concern for decades now. And it is really important for many of our people that they see that these worries are now actually picked up, and that there is a commitment to base government and governance and international negotiations on scientific insights. This is, of course, for many people at universities, very important. Now, most of these people will, of course, say, as Joanna has already said, and Luc also, much more needs to happen than what was decided at COP26. But a lot of the eminent climatologists have really expressed their satisfaction with how COP26 has developed, because indeed, also as the minister has said, there is a movement from, let's say, big words, which are relatively easy to pronounce. Let's admit it. It's relatively easy to say we will be net zero in 2050. When this is said by senior management of a company, they are also saying, well, when I will not be longer here, that's relatively easy. The difficult part is really, to get things going and and Luc already hinted to that, to set up a pathway. Now, universities will also have to do that now, and because we have, of course, in a university, it's as diverse as the society is. So a lot of scientists are really truly concerned about climate, but there are also there is also still a quite large bunch of engineers, for instance, that have been working, let's say, in traditional fields for many decades, and they now get the message very clearly that we're serious about climate, and we are serious about this net zero transition. And this is also important, and universities and funding agencies will have to adjust their funding policies to make sure that we can indeed make that transition. That's quite obvious, yes. So it's diverse, but okay, I think many people feel relieved that this international process has gone on.
Good. Well, that's 3 positive responses out of 4. Now let's hear from Gunnar Mundt, European Investment Bank. Gunnar, I mean, obviously coming from the perspective of essentially the world's largest portfolio or promotional bank with probably its strictest environmental standards, were you happy with what you heard from Glasgow? What do you think it means for technology and climate and energy related investments for an organization like EIB?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I can concur with my co-panelists. I think Glasgow was a success. It was successful, of course, also because if you take all of these commitments, all the pledges together, we have at least a chance of coming close to this 1.5% degrees centigrade target, which from our point of view is really essential. We have also tied all our targets for the European Investment Bank to that target. What it means, on the other hand, is of course that a lot more needs to be done and a lot more needs to be invested. And we were quite happy to see that a very large part of the financial sector has also committed to financing this transition. This is not just the public banks, the promotional banks like the EIB, this is also the commercial banks and the investment funds. Nevertheless, we all know that even this committed money will not be enough to finance this transition until 2050. There also a lot more needs to be done in the future. And if we look at what and where we need to invest, it is really across the board. One area, and we are very happy that this gains now more visibility, is adaptation, which we believe has probably been a little bit neglected. But on the mitigation side, for sure, we also need to look much more closely at what is not yet there. That means basically new technologies we need a lot of investment in science, research, technology, innovation. And this, to my mind, has also for a very long time been neglected, because we are of the opinion that with what we have today, we will not be able to reach net zero by 2050, and we might not even be able to reach the 2030 targets. So the question is, of course, how do we stimulate this investment? And I said before, there's not enough money despite all the commitments. We need to do this in a clever way and combining this. And this is what we try to do as European Investment Bank, combining public money. The Commission is very helpful where the EIB puts its own equity into the picture. Then, of course, we need the private sector. A very large part of this investment needs to come from the private sector. And I think this is where the financial sector will focus in the next few years.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those opening reflections. And just a quick reminder to the audience: if you have any particular questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll do our best to come to them a little later in the discussions. But we're going to turn now to well, the most obvious of targets for science business, which of course is Horizon Europe, Europe's flagship research and innovation program. So let me turn to Joanna now and just ask, in the context of the Commission's research and innovation policy and the Horizon Europe program in a whole, do the outcomes of Glasgow imply any fundamental change of direction or any new priorities that you think will be built into or integrated into the program in the years to come?
I think, put very simply, what needs to influence and what is already influencing, and I will say why and how in a few minutes. The Horizon program, not only in the architecture, but also in the way it's implemented, which is even more important, is that there is a sense of urgency. And secondly, that the change needs to be systemic. And also we need to go much more towards impact. In other words, we need to step up the deployment of research results in a more efficient, visible, and I would say cumulative way. And I say that because we need to, as it was said also by the Minister earlier, you know, science is not developed in silos, but neither should policies be. And therefore, the results of research and the results of what the research community has been producing should quickly go into innovation. Now, of course, this is what we believe is necessary in order to hasten, in order to accelerate, in order to precipitate that transition, which, by the way, no amount of money thrown at it alone, no amount of research thrown at it alone, and no amount of innovation thrown at it alone will do the trick. Because at the end of the day, we are trying and we have to influence, first of all, behavioral change in individuals, but also the business models of companies. But not only that, I would say also the way that the framework of policies is developed. We cannot think in terms of research or innovation being the one-stop shop that will solve all the issues that we have in front of us. Because at the end of the day, if we look at, I don't know, the way that we live and how we live and where we live and what energy we use, it's a whole toolbox. It's the policy, it's the incentives, it's the pricing, it's the state aid, it's competition, it's procurement, it's so many other policies. If you look at the Fit for 55 proposal, for instance, from the Commission, I mean, this is the way it has been built. It has not been built by itself. It has been built also with looking at so many other policies that need to be addressed in the same breath, nearly. So I would say, yes, COP means that we need to not only realize in concept, but actually implement that it means a systemic change that needs to occur faster. It needs to be deployment of solutions at greater pace and more effectively. And I would hasten to add also affordable, because I think this is, you know, when we talk about just transition, this is what we're talking about. We can't just talk about the 3% GDP target when we talk about research. we have to talk about reorganizing our R&I activities to increase the impact and uptake. And what I mean here, and this is why I'm sure that all your panelists and all your participants here have heard about our missions or Horizon Europe missions. And the whole concept of these missions, and there are 5 of them, it's about adaptation of climate adaptation, it's about clean oceans, it's about cities, it's about cancer, and it's about soil. As you see, all of them are related. Maybe cancer, even if one could make the argument that pollution is also causing more cancer as we go along, and we need to tackle the root cause. But all the others are directly related to the global challenges that we've all been mentioning here, that have been all dealt with under COP. So, including, by the way, biodiversity, which sometimes we just sort of put at the side, pretending that just the emissions will do the trick. Again, it won't, because biodiversity itself and nature-based solutions, investment in nature-based solutions, for instance, is key also to getting there. So I think, as I said, the R&I policies is not enough. You need the right framework. You need to accelerate the deployment, and you only do that if you've got the right regulatory toolbox, you've got the right pricing, you've got the right competition framework, state aid, procurement, and policies. And by the way, it's not just the EU pushing for this; it needs the member states as well to do their bit at the national level, as obviously they should.
Very much for that. So I have a follow-up question, then I'm also going to invite the other panelists to comment on this. I think there's a significant dimension of Horizon, as you've mentioned, which is very much about deployment, demonstration, getting new technologies to market more effectively and more rapidly. But I think we've also seen unmitigated and unprecedented climate effects here in Western Europe for perhaps the first time in centuries. Yep. So do we have the balance right, do you think? Do we need to be investing more or putting more scientific emphasis on foresight, on modeling and understanding the changing dynamics within our climate systems, and not just focusing heavily on the technologies themselves and their deployment?
You're talking about climate science. And you're talking about the need to invest as such in climate science and our ability, as in man's ability, human ability, to understand the atmospheric processes themselves, and in order to have better projections for the future, and in order to be able to anticipate, for instance, disaster and whether there are risks for disaster. So I think that we need to invest much more in the adaptation options, for instance. And I think in order to do that, we need to invest more in science itself. Now, of course, I have been talking about framework and policies as and research not being enough, but I think there needs to be a realization that whereas the whole event like COP and other such like intergovernmental conferences are very political, and they need to be, but we need to keep on investing in the credibility. Because more and more, I think policy needs to be not only informed by science and inspired by science, but also validated by science. And I would say advised by science. And I think this is a process that needs to be joined up much more. The ecosystem needs to be joined up much more at the global level, not only at the EU level. And I know that we're investing ourselves much more in that. If you look at, for example, the global Earth observation systems, of course, like Copernicus, and that we have been investing in. I mean, these are, the things that will help us also help the underdeveloped or less developed communities, which are even at more risk, at much more vulnerable risk, in order to help them, not only with the damage that's caused after the disaster, but also to prevent the disaster. And in order for that to happen, I think much more space for investment and for policy needs to be given to science advising policy.
Thank you, Joanna. We'll come back to a couple of those last comments in a minute. But let me turn it over to Luc, Gunnar, and Gerard. Any initial thoughts on this balance between the technology development and deployment and the investments needed in climate science to understand what on earth is going on? Perhaps, Gerard, you'd like to go first on this.
Hey, thank you, Simon. Yeah, I agree with a lot that Joanna has said. I think we should really realize that we still need better fundamental understanding of our climate system, not to start to act, but indeed to better predict and to better, understand what is waiting for us in the future. We know that, ice sheet stability is not fully understood at this moment. So we don't know exactly by how much the seas are going to rise given a certain temperature rise. We don't know how the jet stream is going to respond to even greater warming than today, and we need to, to do more science to do so. She also said, and I think that's very important, that also other policies than climate science need to be informed by science. And I would really like to stress that, the importance of that, because I think that there is still a lot of work to be done, where we see sometimes that policies are informed rather by, let's say, popular and nice sounding concepts, rather than what has been proven scientifically to be right and to be correct. And scientists also have a job there. They should not only do the science, but also communicate it to the people and help policymakers in transferring this sometimes a little bit difficult knowledge to the difficult message to let's say the general public. That's really important as well. And one point I would like to make, and there I would like to I think not deviate from what Joanna said, but complement it. Of course, I can fully understand to drive towards a rapid implementation of technology, and we need to do so. And we need research to understand how we can do this. That's absolutely true. Yet I would argue we also need, we continue to need, let's say, blue sky science, science full of risks, which will fail in maybe 50, 60, 70% of the time. But from time to time, there will be something radically new emerging that we didn't think of before, and that will help us to make a major leap. I cannot predict what these major leaps are, because then, we wouldn't need that science. But we still need to do that. And if you want to do that, I'm totally convinced, then we need to set up specific programs, specific scientific programs to do this. And also my university is at fault for not doing so. And this does not work. If you put all the science in one bunch, use the same criteria throughout the board, then it's always the high risk, potentially high gain science that will lose. That will go out first. And that is something we need to avoid in Europe. And also, then that's the last point I'm going to make, is if science offers technologies, then we should also work towards making sure that they are accepted in a broader society. The minister has referred to genetic technology for plant engineering. This is not possible at the moment at the European continent. I think personally that is a pity, and that we should try to lift such barriers. These are my takes.
Wonderful, thank you, Gerard. So let's stick a bit with this question about sort of risk levels, blue sky. Maybe we should start calling it green sky science in this particular conversation. Right. But I mean, Gunnar, before we had today's event, we talked a little bit about the technology portfolio for the transitions in Europe, and perhaps the need to put more money into the high risk endeavors that could actually help us to accelerate in terms of the net zero transition. So I'm going to ask you for your perspectives on that, and then we're going to come to Luke and talk about what this means for corporate R&D investment strategy. But let's hear your thoughts on this first.
Oh, well, yeah. Gunnar?
Yeah, shall I start?
Yes,
yeah.
Please
okay,
go ahead.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Okay, I try to be very brief, just 2 points. One is, again, I think we need to invest a lot more in science for 2 reasons. Just think of what banks are struggling with at the moment. You know that the European Central Bank has started a climate stress test. So they test banks' balance sheets for their exposure to climate risk, both the physical and the transition risk. At the EIB, we started this project 2 years ago. And it was really a fascinating, also intellectually really interesting exercise to imagine how your credit portfolio or your investments will be affected, especially with very long tenors of our financing, in the future by climate change. The interesting thing is climate modeling has become a lot better, and we can narrow this much more to a narrow range of possible outcomes. Still, if you try to value the potential losses that climate change might bring to your portfolio, we are talking about a broad range of hundreds of billions of euros in Europe, really large amounts. So the better these climate models become, the cheaper it is for the financial industry to price these risks. So the better we become in pricing these risks, the lower will be the risk pricing for our financing in the future. And this, on the other hand, has a huge impact and benefit for all the whole economy, basically. So that's one point why we need more science, and I would not stop financing that at all. The second point I would like to make is we need indeed to invest in new technologies. Look at the energy sector. In principle, we have two renewable energy technologies that we can scale up. Bioenergy, personally, not all my colleagues agree, but bioenergy, from my point of view, is not really scalable. And if you scale it up, you certainly have sustainability problems. So we have two, solar, PV, and wind. This is not enough to drive this transition to net zero. To my mind, exactly as was said by Gerard, we probably need something completely new that we haven't even thought about today, that would take us to 2050 and beyond. So this is in the area of energy technologies. Then in the area of industrial processes, clean skies. Honestly, we are at the beginning of this. And if you transform an industrial process, you probably need decades to do that in a cost-efficient, competitive manner. So we need a lot more research there. And by the way, we discussed to Simon about this before. From my point of view, probably we won't reach this zero at 2050 at the current pace. Even if we step it up, we probably also need to think about how we remove carbon from the atmosphere. And this whole area of negative emission technologies needs to be looked at much more closely. And to my mind, this is also completely underfunded at the moment. When I'm saying this, this is difficult for a bank to finance, but I think there's a lot of money, public money, private money, that should go into this area and de-risk it in order to make it possible. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Gunnar. That's an important message for the Commission as well to think about in terms of future thematics and priorities. But let's hear from Luc now. I mean, Luc, I'm sure a lot of this is music to your ears, but you're in charge of designing the research and development strategy for one of Europe's leading energy and power companies. So both from the energy/power perspective, but also the industrial perspective that Gunnar has mentioned. I mean, how do you decide where to invest? How do you decide what to try and put into your portfolio in terms of optimizing what you've already got and know how to do versus this green sky thinking about trying to invent the technologies of the future?
Well, let me maybe start by reassuring Gerard, when we talk about the net zero by 2045 and our CEO announces these things, then there is a real roadmap behind there. We know how we will do it. We know how we will get there in intermediate steps. We will know that by 2030, we will have 50 additional gigawatts of renewables in our portfolio. And so we have planned out all that trajectory. So that's a first good thing. Of course, we have to balance within that exercise between what we will be doing on existing technologies, renewable energy. For example, if we think about solar energy, it's all a question about accessing more and more space where we can put solar panels. And so we were working on things like floating offshore PV panels, which will be, it's a huge solution. There's a lot of space there. We can put them in between the offshore wind turbines. These are places which are available, which are there to be used and to capture electricity. And then you need, of course, research on materials and on these panels and on these floaters. But this is all reasonably easy, I would say, to do. So we are focusing a lot on that because this is something which will be happening in 5 to 10 years. This is tomorrow in our world. Same thing when we think about putting solar together with the use of land for agriculture. It is possible, and it can be a win-win situation where you create a kind of microclimate underneath transparent solar panels, where you can have even more harvesting and protection against hails, for example. These are things which we are studying and which we are working on today, but that's on the electricity side. And as I said in the beginning, we think there's a lot to be done on the molecules side as well, on the green hydrogen, for example. And this is where I may slightly disagree with Gunnar. I agree that bio energy may not be the first solution at the end, but it will be a very important one in the transition. We will be using that biomass to create biomethane tomorrow. And this is what we will be using when we talk about greenifying our thermal fleet, our combined cycles, for example. We'll be injecting biomethane in these machines. And this will be a very important step in the transition. And that is things which are happening tomorrow. And of course, we are looking as well on what could be technologies for the day after. For example, we are currently co-testing a pilot on what they call supercritical CO2 cycles in the United States, where you will be doing oxycombustion of gas, which can be green gas or normal gas or natural gas. But while doing it in that circle, you will be capturing your CO2 under pressure in a very high purity. This is not something to be stored as such. It's perfect to be used, and the usage of carbon capture is something where we are focusing on a lot as well, because that can be a key to start creating those molecules, which I was talking about, which can be then transferred to e-fuels, for example. Now, when we talk about these choices we have to make between the different technologies for tomorrow, for the day after, yeah, of course, we have our alignment with our strategy towards the net carbon story, which is clear for us. But we also think about how this will be impacting our business, of course. For example, if we think about green gases, this is something which can be a benefit for us, because we can combine our electrical world with the gas world and start using that flexibility between those systems, in systems to compensate, to buffer things, for example. Now, green hydrogen has been a very big point on our in our roadmaps, and we are looking not only at the production side, where of course we're thinking about electrolysis of renewable energy when you have too much of it, which can be done on the other side of the world. Then you need to transport it. A lot of discussion around that. But if you need to transport hydrogen, it's a challenge. I mean, you have to pressure it down, you have to cool it down, you have to mix it with other molecules to make something that transports it easily. Now, this is an opportunity, because there you are creating things that you will be using in the industry. You are creating methanol, you're creating other chemical components that can be straight down used to decarbonize the industry. So we are a big believer on that part, and we think that there's a lot to be done. Now, from our point of view, probably we will get into a phase where there will be a scarcity of green hydrogen. There will be not enough green hydrogen at a certain stage. So we'll have to think about what are the usages which have, first of all, most impact on the decarbonization, which processes of our clients, the industry, should be decarbonized first and has the biggest impact, where should we use our green hydrogen, and of course, where can we extract the most value. And this is where we look really broadly, and we're not thinking only about chemicals or only about co-injecting it in our gas infrastructure, but we're also thinking about things like, for example, proteins. Maybe we should make some food at a certain stage with some of this green hydrogen combined with the CO2 we captured and some nitrates we can find. The impact on decarbonization can be huge, and we have to understand all these usages to make sure that we offer this to our clients. Now, maybe to sum up and to come at the final choice we have made in our roadmaps is mainly about storage, everything around storage, because we think that storage is a very important tool in the energy transition to compensate and to create that flexibility. Lithium ion pushed by EV, following that very closely, show that it will have applications in our world as well, which we already have, of course, for now. But we think there's a chance for Europe to invest in technologies which are much better fit to live with our integrated electricity system. We're thinking about redox flow batteries. We're thinking about more developments on pumped hydro, all these kinds of new technologies around storage, which will not only give an opportunity for Europe to position itself as a world leader on those new technologies, but which often also come with a much more interesting way towards, for example, rare earth materials. These technologies typically will be using quite standard materials, which we find anywhere around the world. So we're focusing on these different choices. And maybe just to close up one thing about the funding for this project and what we saw on the Innovation Fund round one. I think we were quite convinced that the choices which were made and the way it was approached is already very good and very much aligned with COP26. What we see is that there is a need for fine-tuning. We see that, for example, the focus on the absolute emission reduction, which is a defendable case, maybe should be re-evaluated a little bit so that in the end, the success rate would be bigger than now. I think there was 7 projects out of 300 selected, which is only 2.5%. I'm not sure that we have the time to do cherry picking. We might probably have to do much more than that on these industrialization projects. So that would be how we define our choices in that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Luc, and an awful lot of information to process there. So I think we've got about 10, 12 minutes left. So I'm going to invite Joanna, Gunnar and Gerard to reflect and maybe comment on that. I mean, all of this sort of complexity in terms of technology selection, and also, questions that are coming from the audience about the role of hydrogen. Should Europe still be investing in ITER and nuclear fusion as sort of these potential game-changing solutions? Is there anything that you've heard, Joanna, that really surprises you or makes you think that there are alternative approaches or themes that could be addressed through Horizon or the industrial partnerships or some of the other instruments that the EU is involved in?
Well, I mean, I can't say that I have been surprised by what I heard. What I think is very positive is that the industry itself is making technology roadmaps, if you like, for net zero emissions itself, and that they are fully fully on board. What I hope is that the governments in the different countries and wherever they are will actually think in these terms and allow climate science and new technologies to actually influence their policy making as well, which I think is the one where it will be quite a tougher nut to crack. What's something that I like very much is the point that was made earlier about communication, and this is something I really worry about, because it's one thing, being involved in this, what is now a broader debate about, where we are, what we need to do, how we could tackle it, and the responsibility that each one of us has. I think that's already saying a lot about what progress we made. Until a few years ago, there were still the climate deniers, and governments were not taking it as serious as they should. But on the other hand, now we don't really have time much to think, in terms of what should we do. I think we need to have a roadmap which is really like clear and being followed, and with the buy-in of everyone. And I think the communication part really needs to play a bigger role here. Why? Because at the end of the day, we're not only talking about big money for big technologies, big money for researchers, big money for science, and big money for the innovators. We're talking about people's behavior at the end of the day, and also people's lives. So the social innovation part needs to be also part of this. And I think this is where we also need to invest a lot of time and effort. In terms of what the EU instruments and Horizon Europe and how that has been constructed, I think one needs to make a point that, as I said, not only are the missions a cross-cutting type of tool that are forcing us all, even within the EU construct, to really mainstream these goals as part of our policy. We can't have the Fit for 55 without having a carbon border adjustment mechanism, for instance, or a revision of the state aid rules, or energy taxation, a review of that. But we also have to have other tools and other ways of dealing with, for instance, how we bring this technology to the market. It might not be the best one forward, but we need to invest in partnerships, for instance, in order to find out, what's the best way to go about the clean technology, clean steel, bioeconomy, bio-based green aviation, waterborne transport, ecosystem services, the built environment. All of this are existing today in the EU's ecosystem of Horizon Europe, which are now called the Green Deal missions. But we also have, other tools that we need to use more of, like we have shown also in COP, with international collaboration, for instance. That is another one that needs to be giving not only the example, but the credibility, I would say, to the individual for whom we're making big asks, for how to live henceforth, and now what to work on and what to work in, and where to put our money. So, for instance, what has happened with the global methane pledge, for instance, what has happened with the global forest finance pledge in COP26, the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa, for instance, that France, Germany, and the EU have entered into, the EU Catalyst Partnership, for instance, again, to accelerate their deployments and rapidly commercialize innovative technologies that will help to deliver the Green Deal ambitions and the EU climate targets. All this create a sort of momentum, that it's not only what is happening in our immediate reality, which at the end of the day will make the most difference for most people, but it's also with the push, the international push, and therefore the credibility that the investments, that the investors are making in order to make it happen also on the global, and we're all aligned in the same direction.
Very much, Joanna. So we've got one last question that I'd like to bring in from a member of the audience, but it also ties in with a couple of reflections already shared about the issue of timelines. And I think Gunnar in particular saying that we have this likelihood that given the current technology portfolio, we are probably going to overshoot some of the targets that have been set in Glasgow and elsewhere. So the question is really within sort of Europe's research and innovation agenda, are we giving enough space to fallback solutions? And by extension, are we doing enough with the current technologies that we have, mature technologies, to try and put us on a trajectory that may be slightly beyond the timelines agreed in Glasgow, or could actually have a greater short-term impact if we just deployed them in a smarter way in different parts of the industrial ecosystem and arguably in our private lives as well? Now, Gerard, I know that you had a couple of thoughts on this before the meeting, so I'm going to turn to you first, and then closing comments from Gunnar, from Luke, and then final word for Joanna.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, a resounding yes, indeed. And I think Joanna has talked a lot about social innovation policy, and that's absolutely important. But we marginally touched, for instance, on problems like pricing of energy. And these are really big issues. Heat pumps, they are efficient. They are energy efficient. The only problem that we have in many European countries for a massive implementation is that governments tax electricity far more than they do fossil fuels. Now, that's something, you don't need new technology, new chips to solve that. You need a political class that, really puts itself to work and changes that, because it has to change. If we would change that, for instance, just to give you an example, Simon, we live in Flanders. About 20% of our emissions, one fifth, is coming from buildings, and we can get completely rid of that with existing technology. There is nothing needed that we don't have to do that. The same to some extent is true for transportation, also there, but we could move faster than we do. But there, fortunately, I see more willingness, at least with the politicians that I'm talking to move now very, very quickly. For instance, Flanders has said, we will not allow sale of fossil fuel cars after 2029, which is the day after tomorrow, really. That's really fast, and that will certainly help. And that's regulation. It does not need, well, of course, we need investments that go along with that, but the regulation will push the investments to a large extent. Many companies, I'm sure, in Flanders are now already thinking about how are we going to make a profit out of that, and that's a good thing. And what we also should realize that is that if we deploy these kind of technologies massively, they become cheaper. Even heat pumps have halved in price in Switzerland since they have become widely deployed. So it's not only about, pushing people to behave differently. We can really, giving the right price signals, we can do a lot to accelerate this transition using existing technology. And I strongly believe that we should do that, yes.
Thank you, Gerard. So Luke, final thoughts from you, and then to Gunnar for the last comments.
In fact, I think one thing we all share is that there is a need for a bigger sense of urgency. And there was a Flemish playwright on television this weekend, and he was saying maybe we should all be a little bit more Buddhist about it and think that we're all reincarnating in the next life. And then suddenly it's not about the next generations, but it's about you in the next life. And then maybe that sense of urgency could become a bit bigger. I'm not sharing the full optimism of Minister Freeman. I think we should still go faster, still go bigger. And I think this was shared by all my colleague panelists today.
Luke, and who knows, Joanna, perhaps we can see a new kind of spiritual philosophy being brought into Horizon Europe as well, around the behavioral change and reincarnation. Let's see. But Gunnar, the final word is yours. Let's hear what you have to think on the on this.
Thanks very much. Honestly, I think we need to use all tools that we have at our disposal. We need to deploy them now and massively. And the heat pump is a good example. There's still some room to deploy this faster. Again, I think there's very little time to do this. Price plays a large role, and to make this easier for people to switch, we should also think about pricing and carbon pricing and stopping funding the fossil dirty fuels and in a way subsidizing then the greener technologies. Still, I believe we need to look at a portfolio of tools, and this portfolio needs to become larger, and it should be larger than what we have today. Thanks.
Well, it seems clear from these discussions that it's a combination of political will, money, but at the same time, it's a huge opportunity. And if we can get the right kind of alignment between the various policy instruments and programs that Joanna was referencing earlier, the various technology debates that have also been discussed, and we get the right kind of long-term commitment from the financial community, then maybe we do have a chance of delivering on the Glasgow targets and outcomes after all. So with that, I'm pleased, although a little regretful, to have to bring this conversation and event to an end. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Joanna Drake, Gunnar Munt, Luke Goossens, and Gerard Govers, for taking the time to share their thoughts and inspiration with us today. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for following, I hope with great enthusiasm, over the last hour and 20 minutes or so. And above all, I hope that you all stay safe and well in these continually troubled times, with the shadows of COVID lengthening in many parts of Europe. So we wish you great success in your projects, in your personal lives, and we hope that you have a very safe and healthy holiday season. And we look forward to seeing you again at Science Business Event in 2022. Thank you ever so much, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.